We are not the first civilization. We are the seventh. The first clue does not come from ancient texts. It comes from stone itself, from structures that should not exist, from precision that appears without progression, from knowledge encoded into architecture before knowledge was supposed to exist. The evidence is not hidden. It is buried, beneath ice cores recording planetary catastrophes, beneath ocean floors where coastlines drowned, beneath the stories we tell ourselves about linear progress, that humanity climbed steadily from caves to cities, from stone to steel, from darkness to light. But the Earth does not tell that story. The Earth records interruption. 6 times before, civilizations rose. 6 times, knowledge accumulated. 6 times, something reset the board, wiping cities from coastlines, scattering populations into fragments, forcing survivors to rebuild with only inherited memories of what came before. The pattern is invisible only if you refuse to see it. But once recognized, it appears everywhere. The first place it appears is in the structures themselves. Stand in front of an ancient monument and ask yourself a simple question. Does this look like a first attempt? The Great Pyramid at Giza, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, the megaliths at Baalbek, Sacsayhuaman in Peru. These structures do not look like experiments. They look like mastery, and that creates a problem. Because if progress is linear, if humanity advanced steadily from primitive to sophisticated, then the oldest structures should be the crudest, the most experimental, the least impressive. Early attempts marked by trial and error. Simple designs gradually refined over centuries. Technology improving incrementally as knowledge accumulated. That is what linear progress predicts. That is not what we find. What we find is the opposite. The oldest structures are the most precise, the most sophisticated, the most inexplicably advanced. And then, as time moves forward, something strange happens. The quality deteriorates. This is not speculation. This is observable archaeological fact. The first pyramids built in Egypt, the ones at Giza during the 4th dynasty, represent the pinnacle of pyramid construction, perfect alignment to cardinal directions, internal chambers demonstrating advanced understanding of weight distribution, limestone casing stones fitted so precisely that a razor blade cannot slip between them. Later, pyramids show progressive decline, rougher masonry, less sophisticated engineering, collapsed structures that did not survive their own weight. The pattern suggests not learning, but forgetting, not invention, but inheritance, as if the builders at Giza were working from knowledge they possessed completely, and later generations, lacking that complete understanding, could only approximate what came before. This inverted pattern, where oldest equals most advanced, appears globally, not in one location that might be explained as anomaly, everywhere. Göbekli Tepe sits on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey. When archaeologists first excavated it in the 1990s, they expected a medieval structure, perhaps Byzantine, maybe Roman if they were fortunate. What they found rewrote the acceptable timeline of human civilization. Stone pillars, T-shaped, some weighing 20 tons, arranged in circular enclosures, covered with intricate carvings, foxes, vultures, serpents, abstract symbols whose meaning remains opaque. The site dates to 11,600 years ago. That date matters. 11,600 years ago, according to standard archaeological models, humans were hunter-gatherers, small nomadic bands, no agriculture, no permanent settlements, no cities, no temples, no written language, no metal tools, no infrastructure capable of moving 20-ton stones, no social organization capable of coordinating the labor required to carve, transport, and erect dozens of massive pillars arranged with geometric precision. And yet, Göbekli Tepe exists, not as crude megaliths stacked clumsily by Stone Age peoples experimenting with monumental construction, but as sophisticated architecture demonstrating advanced understanding of geometry, astronomy, and engineering. The pillars align with celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, stellar risings that require multi-generational observation to track, the kind of astronomical knowledge that supposedly would not be systematized for another 7,000 years. The carvings show artistic sophistication, not primitive stick figures, detailed bas-reliefs of animals rendered with anatomical accuracy, abstract symbolism suggesting complex belief systems or encoded information. There is no learning curve, no simpler predecessors, showing how builders gradually figured out how to work stone. The site appears fully formed, complete, as if the knowledge arrived intact. And then, around 8000 BCE, the builders deliberately buried it. They filled the circular enclosures with debris, covered the pillars, sealed the site beneath tons of soil, preserved it, almost as if they knew something was coming and wanted the knowledge to survive. When archaeologists search for older sites showing the developmental stages that led to Göbekli Tepe, they find nothing. The site has no architectural ancestors. It stands alone in time. Unprecedented. The standard response. This represents a cognitive revolution, a sudden leap in human capability. Neurological evolution produced behaviorally modern humans who spontaneously developed complex symbolic thought and organizational structures. That explanation has problems. Cognitive revolution does not explain where the astronomical knowledge came from. Tracking precession requires sustained observation across thousands of years. That requires continuity, stability, institutional memory. Hunter-gatherer bands migrating seasonally do not maintain observatories for millennia, unless the observation was already complete, already known, already encoded into inherited tradition from an earlier time. The alternative interpretation, Göbekli Tepe, is not the beginning of monumental architecture. It is a recovery point, a place where survivors of an earlier catastrophe rebuilt what they remembered, not inventing complexity from scratch, but reconstructing it from memory. The pattern repeats. In the Sahara Desert, where sand now stretches empty for thousands of miles, there is a stone circle, Nabta Playa. 7,000 years ago, when the Sahara was not desert but savanna, with seasonal lakes and grasslands, someone arranged massive stones into a precise astronomical calendar. The circle marks summer solstice sunrise, aligns with specific stars, functions as both calendar and observatory. This is 3,000 years before Egypt's Old Kingdom, 3,000 years before the first pharaohs, 3,000 years before the pyramids. The archaeological context says the builders were pastoralists, cattle herders, moving seasonally between grazing lands. The structure says something else. It says, someone here understood celestial mechanics. Someone observed the sky long enough to map stellar positions. Someone coordinated labor to move multi-ton stones into geometrically precise arrangements. That is not pastoralist behavior. That is specialized astronomical knowledge requiring sustained effort across generations. Where did it come from? The question has no comfortable answer within conventional chronology. In Louisiana, along the Mississippi River, earthworks rise from floodplains. Poverty Point, dated to 3,700 years ago. The site consists of concentric ridges arranged in geometric patterns, 6 ridges, each elevated several meters, together forming a design visible only from above, a perspective the builders could never have seen without aerial view. The earthworks required moving 30 million cubic feet of soil by hand, without wheeled vehicles, without domesticated draft animals. The people who built Poverty Point had no pottery, no evidence of agriculture, no permanent settlements in the conventional sense. Yet they coordinated labor on a scale that rivals Egyptian pyramid construction. And they did it 3,000 years before Christ, in North America, in complete isolation from Old World civilizations. The standard explanation: seasonal gatherings, periodic labor projects during abundant harvest times. That explanation requires assuming that pre-agricultural peoples with no centralized authority spontaneously organized continent-wide trade networks, because Poverty Point contains copper from the Great Lakes, mica from Appalachia, stone from distant quarries hundreds of miles away. It requires assuming that people living in temporary camps decided to invest generations of labor, moving millions of cubic feet of earth to create monuments they would never complete in their lifetimes, without writing to coordinate the project across generations, without political structures to compel or organize labor, without ideological framework to justify the effort, unless they were not inventing monumental construction, unless they were continuing it, maintaining traditions inherited from earlier peoples who had already established the practice. And Poverty Point represents not innovation, but cultural persistence, a fragment of knowledge carried forward from a time before. In Peru, on the Pacific coast, pyramids rise from desert valleys. Corral soup, 5,000 years old, contemporary with Egypt's Old Kingdom, but developed independently. No contact, no shared technology, no cultural exchange. The site shows urban planning, pyramids, plazas, residential districts, sophisticated irrigation, evidence of astronomical observation encoded into architectural alignments. This is the oldest known civilization in the Americas, and it appears suddenly, fully formed, with no clear precursor. The pattern is global. Complexity does not gradually emerge from simplicity. It appears abruptly, often fully developed, then degrades over time, as if each of these sites represents not the invention of civilization, but its reconstruction. By people who remembered something greater, by people rebuilding from fragments. The precision problem deepens when examining megalithic masonry. At Sacsayhuaman, above Cusco, Peru, massive stones fit together so precisely that mortar was unnecessary. The joints are not rough, they are seamless. Stones weighing hundreds of tons, shaped with curves and angles that interlock perfectly, each face matching its neighbor with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. Modern engineers study these walls and struggle to explain the construction methodology, not because ancient peoples were incapable, but because the precision suggests technology we associate with industrial civilization, laser levels, computer-aided design, diamond-tipped cutting tools. The Inca, who inherited these structures, did not build them. They said so explicitly in their own records. They attributed the construction to earlier peoples, giants, gods, beings from before the flood. The Spanish conquistadors asked the Inca, "Who built this?" The Inca replied, "We do not know. They were here before us." At Baalbek, in modern Lebanon, foundation stones called trilithons weigh 800 tons each. They were quarried a kilometer away, transported, lifted, positioned with precision. Each stone is a single piece of carved limestone, 60 feet long, 15 feet wide, 13 feet thick. Moving one requires technology that did not officially exist in the ancient world. No wooden rollers, no Bronze Age tools, no accepted methodology, and yet they sit there, mortared together, part of a foundation that has survived earthquakes for thousands of years, while later Roman construction crumbled around them. These are not primitive accomplishments. These demonstrate sophisticated understanding of geology, weight distribution, material properties, and engineering principles that modern builders must study for years to master. The knowledge is not crude. It is complete, arrived whole. And where knowledge appears whole, without developmental stages, without trial and error, without the incremental improvements that characterize genuine innovation, it suggests inheritance. Someone knew already. Someone had solved these problems before, and someone passed that knowledge forward. The question becomes unavoidable. If the oldest structures are the most advanced, if precision appears without progression, if knowledge arrives complete rather than developing gradually, then where did it originate? The conventional answer: nowhere. These represent independent innovations, cognitive leaps, sudden insights that spontaneously arose in scattered human populations. That answer requires believing in remarkable coincidence. That hunter-gatherers in Turkey, pastoralists in Egypt, pre-agricultural peoples in Louisiana and isolated coastal populations in Peru all independently developed advanced astronomical observation, megalithic construction techniques, and sophisticated engineering knowledge within relatively narrow time windows. And then, having invented these capabilities, largely forgot them, allowing later generations to build less impressively despite having more resources, more population, more accumulated knowledge. That is the coincidence required by the conventional model. The alternative requires only one assumption, that these are not first attempts, that these are recoveries, built by people who inherited knowledge from an earlier time, a prior epoch, a civilization that rose, accumulated sophistication, and then, for reasons documented in geology, experienced catastrophic interruption. The survivors carried what they could. Some carried astronomical knowledge. Some carried engineering techniques. Some carried architectural traditions. They rebuilt what they remembered. The structures we call ancient are not the origins of human sophistication. They are what remained after catastrophe, the earliest visible points in a recovery process, not the invention of civilization, but its reconstruction. And if that is true, if what we call the beginning was actually a rebuilding, then the question shifts. What came before? Where is the knowledge ancestry, the precursor civilizations, the original source of the sophistication these monuments encode? The evidence for that lies not in what survived on high ground. It lies in what time erased, what the earth buried, what the oceans swallowed when the ice melted and the seas rose and entire landscapes vanished beneath hundreds of feet of water. The story continues not in temples we can visit, but in landscapes we can no longer see. The oldest are most advanced. The problem reveals itself most clearly in Egypt, not in mythology, not in fringe theories about alien architects or lost Atlantean technology, in documented, observable, measurable architectural decline. The first pyramids are the best pyramids. That sentence should not be true if civilization developed linearly. If Egyptian culture gradually accumulated knowledge, learning through experimentation, refining techniques across generations, building institutional expertise, then later pyramids should surpass earlier ones. Later engineers should improve on earlier designs. Later workers should develop better tools. Later architects should solve problems their predecessors could not. That is how technology progresses. That is not what happened. The Great Pyramid at Giza, attributed to Khufu, dated to roughly 4,500 years ago, represents the absolute pinnacle of pyramid construction in Egypt, not just in scale, in precision. The base is leveled to within 1 inch across a footprint covering 13 acres. The alignment to true north deviates by only 3/60ths of a single degree. The internal chambers demonstrate sophisticated understanding of core-build ceilings, weight distribution, and structural integrity that keeps passages open under millions of tons of stone. The exterior casing stones, now mostly gone, stolen over millennia for other construction, were fitted so precisely that mortar served decorative rather than structural function. The joints measured less than 1/50th of an inch. That is not ancient precision. That is modern precision, the kind achieved with laser levels and computer-aided measurement. Except it was accomplished 4,500 years ago with copper tools and wooden implements, or so the timeline insists. And then, over the following dynasties, something happened. The quality declined. The pyramids built after Giza show progressively rougher construction. Khafre's pyramid, Khufu's successor, is well built but slightly less precise. Menkaura's pyramid, the third at Giza, is smaller and shows less refined masonry. Later, pyramids collapse into rubble piles. The 5th and 6th dynasty pyramids built at Saqqara and Abu Sir crumbled within decades of construction. Their cores were not solid stone, but loose rubble fill held by exterior casing. When the casing stones were removed, the interiors collapsed. These were not improvements on earlier designs. These were inferior copies made by people who no longer fully understood the engineering principles. The trajectory is not upward. It is downward. Not learning, forgetting. The conventional explanation. Egypt's Old Kingdom represented a golden age of centralized power and resources. Later, dynasties fragmented politically. Resources declined. Ambition waned. Less impressive pyramids reflect diminished state capacity, not lost knowledge. That explanation addresses scale, but not technique. A smaller pyramid can still be precisely built. Political fragmentation does not erase engineering knowledge from the minds of master builders. Economic decline does not make people forget how to measure angles or fit stones, unless the knowledge was never completely understood in the first place. Unless the builders of Giza were working from inherited expertise, techniques passed down from an earlier time, and later generations, lacking the full context, could only approximate what came before. That is the pattern that appears when recovery, not invention, produces sophistication. When you inherit a technology without understanding its underlying principles, you can use it, sometimes masterfully, but you cannot improve it. You can only maintain it, and when maintenance fails, you lose it. The Sphinx adds another layer of complication. The conventional date assigns the Sphinx to Khafre, roughly contemporary with the second pyramid at Giza. That places construction around 4,500 years ago during Egypt's 4th dynasty. But the Sphinx sits in an enclosure carved from bedrock, and the walls of that enclosure show weathering patterns that should not exist. Geologist Robert Schoch examined the erosion in the 1990s and concluded the weathering was caused by sustained rainfall, not wind erosion, which creates horizontal patterns, not occasional flooding, which leaves different signatures, but prolonged exposure to rain, vertical channels, deep fissures, the kind of erosion produced by thousands of years of substantial precipitation. The problem: Egypt has not experienced that kind of rainfall in recorded history. The Sahara began drying around 5,000 years ago. By the time of the 4th dynasty, Egypt's climate was already arid. The Nile provided water, but heavy, sustained rainfall did not occur. to produce the erosion visible on the Sphinx enclosure requires going back to when North Africa was wetter, between 7,000 and 12,000 years ago, when the Sahara was savanna, not desert, when Lake Megachad covered an area the size of the Caspian Sea, when rivers flowed where now only sand remains. If Schock's geological analysis is correct, and subsequent geologists have confirmed his identification of the weathering type, then the Sphinx enclosure is far older than Egyptology allows. Perhaps twice as old, perhaps older. The archaeological response: rejection. Not because the geological evidence is flawed, but because accepting it would destabilize the entire chronology of Egyptian civilization. If the Sphinx predates the 4th dynasty by thousands of years, then who carved it? Pre-dynastic Egypt had no centralized state, no pharaohs, no institutional capacity for monumental construction. Accepting an older Sphinx requires accepting that sophisticated stoneworking existed before the official beginning of Egyptian civilization, and if sophisticated stoneworking existed before dynastic Egypt, then where did it come from? The question has no comfortable answer within conventional frameworks. So the geological evidence is set aside, not refuted, simply ignored. The date remains 4,500 years, because changing it would require rewriting textbooks. Institutional inertia prevails over geological data. Sometimes lost knowledge leaves unambiguous artifacts. In 1901, sponge divers working off the Greek island of Antikythera found a shipwreck. Roman, 1st century BCE. Among the cargo, bronze statues, pottery, jewelry, and a corroded lump of bronze gears. For decades, the lump sat in museum storage, unremarkable, barely examined, until someone X-rayed it. Inside, an intricate mechanism, dozens of bronze gears, sophisticated differential gearing, inscriptions, pointers, dials, a mechanical computer, designed to calculate and display astronomical positions, the phases of the moon, eclipse predictions, the movements of planets, even the 4-year cycle of the Olympic Games. The device dates to approximately 100 BCE. Its technology would not appear again in human history for 1,400 years. Not until medieval Islamic astronomers developed astrolabes. Not until Renaissance clockmakers created mechanical orreries. The Antikythera mechanism demonstrates that ancient Greeks possessed gear-cutting technology, understanding of differential mechanics, and astronomical knowledge far beyond what surviving texts suggest. And this is the only example we have. Not because it is the only one that existed, but because it is the only one that survived. Bronze corrodes, wood rots, organic materials vanish, fire consumes libraries, conquerors destroy monuments. The archaeological record is not a complete inventory of what ancient peoples knew. It is a tiny sample of what accidentally survived. If the Antikythera mechanism survived by chance from a single shipwreck, how many similar devices existed that left no trace? how many technologies were developed, used for centuries, and then lost, leaving no evidence except the knowledge they required to create them. The mechanism proves something crucial. Technological sophistication can exist in the ancient world, and it can vanish completely. Not because humanity forgot how to think, but because transmission failed. Wars disrupted craftsmen. Economic collapse ended production. Political fragmentation broke the chains of apprenticeship. And within a few generations, the knowledge was gone. Not impossible to recreate, but requiring starting over, reinventing from basic principles. If this can happen with bronze gears in the historical period, where we have written records, continuous civilization, and documentation, how much more easily could it happen in prehistory? How many technologies might have existed, served their purpose, and left no trace except structures that survived because they were too massive to dismantle? Maps present a similar problem. In 1513, Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis compiled a world map. He used multiple source maps, some Portuguese, some contemporary, some ancient. The map shows the Atlantic coastlines, South America, West Africa, and Antarctica, without ice. The Antarctic coastline on the Piri Reis map matches the actual continental coastline beneath the ice sheet, coastline that has been covered by ice for at least 6,000 years, possibly longer, coastline that was not officially discovered until 1820, coastline that was not accurately mapped until the 1950s, using seismic surveys that could see through ice. Yet there it is, on a map from 1513. Piri Reis noted in his marginal annotations that he compiled the map from older sources, charts that predated his time by centuries, perhaps millennia. In 1531, French cartographer Orontius Finaeus published another world map. Again, Antarctica appears, shown as a separate continent, with mountain ranges in the interior, rivers flowing to the coast, features that match the actual subglacial topography, features not confirmed until modern ground-penetrating radar in the late 20th century. The conventional explanation: the cartographers drew speculative continents. Lucky guesses about what might exist in unexplored regions. That explanation requires believing in remarkable coincidence, that medieval map-makers, with no knowledge of Antarctica's existence, happened to draw a landmass in approximately the correct location, with approximately the correct shape, showing approximately the correct interior features, by accident. The alternative explanation: the medieval maps were copied from older source maps, maps created when Antarctica's coastline was visible, when the continent was not covered by ice, which means someone mapped Antarctica between 6,000 and 15,000 years ago, during or before the last ice age, before civilization officially existed. Someone had the navigational capability to reach Antarctica, the cartographic knowledge to map it accurately, the geographic understanding to create charts detailed enough that copies of copies of copies still retained recognizable features 5,000 years later. That someone is not in our textbooks, that civilization does not appear in our chronologies, but the maps remain, suggesting that advanced seafaring, sophisticated cartography, and sustained long-distance exploration existed long before agriculture, long before cities, long before written language, unless our chronology is incomplete, unless the Ice Age did not prevent civilization. It only destroyed the evidence. Astronomy creates perhaps the most unsettling pattern. Precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, takes 25,920 years to complete one cycle. This is not obvious. It cannot be observed in a single lifetime. It requires sustained observation across thousands of years to detect. Ancient cultures encoded knowledge of precession. The Sphinx at Giza may reference it. Aligned to face Leo during the age of Leo, roughly 10,500 BCE, when the Sphinx's leonine body would symbolically correspond to the constellation rising heliacally at the spring equinox. Angkor Wat in Cambodia encodes precession through architectural alignments that correspond to different ages as the temple's orientation shifts metaphorically through zodiacal epochs. The Nazca lines in Peru contain astronomical alignments tracking precession cycles. How does a hunter-gatherer society maintain an observatory for 10,000 years? How does a pre-literate culture preserve the records required to detect a cycle that takes 260 centuries to complete? The conventional answer: they didn't. These are coincidences. Pareidolia. Modern researchers projecting astronomical knowledge onto structures that had simpler purposes. But the patterns are mathematically precise. The alignments are not approximate. They correspond to specific dates thousands of years apart. That precision does not arise by accident. It requires knowledge, sustained observation, institutional continuity across millennia. The alternative explanation: the astronomical knowledge was inherited. Observatories, established during an earlier epoch when civilization possessed the stability and resources to maintain them. Knowledge encoded into architectural structures deliberately designed to survive catastrophe. Stone lasts, buildings persist, alignments remain observable. If you know catastrophe is coming, if cycles of destruction are understood rather than merely feared, then encoding knowledge into structures becomes rational preservation strategy, not religious symbolism. Information storage. Building observatories that can teach future generations what the sky is doing, what patterns govern celestial movement, what cycles determine planetary stability. These are not temples built to worship gods. These are calendars built to survive apocalypse. The pattern clarifies. Sophisticated knowledge appears suddenly, complete, without developmental predecessors. Then it degrades, fragmenting across generations until only approximations remain. This is not how invention works. This is how inheritance works when transmission is imperfect, when survivors carry fragments of knowledge from a prior time, when they rebuild what they remember, when their children maintain it imperfectly, when their grandchildren mythologize what they can no longer fully comprehend. The structures we call ancient are not origins. They are recovery points, nodes of preserved knowledge in the aftermath of something that interrupted continuity. The question that remains: what interrupted it? What force was powerful enough to break civilizational transmission, to reduce populations to fragments, to destroy infrastructure so completely that only stone monuments survived? The answer is not mysterious. The answer is not hidden. The answer is in the ice, in the sediment layers, in the geological record of planetary catastrophe, in evidence of events so violent they nearly erased humanity entirely. And those events are documented, precisely dated, measurably devastating. The only question is whether civilization existed to experience them. The ice remembers everything. In Greenland and Antarctica, ice sheets accumulate layer by layer. Each winter's snowfall compresses into ice. Each year adds a new stratum. The process continues for hundreds of thousands of years, building columns of frozen time. Scientists drill down through these layers, extract cores, analyze the chemistry. Oxygen isotopes reveal temperature. Dust particles indicate volcanic activity. Air bubbles trapped in ice preserve ancient atmosphere. Carbon dioxide levels, methane concentrations. The composition of air from 800,000 years ago sits locked in ice, waiting to be read. The ice cores tell a story, and it is not a story of gradual change. It is a story of sudden, catastrophic reversals. Temperature does not shift slowly over millennia. It spikes. It plummets. 10 degrees Fahrenheit in a single decade. 15 degrees in a generation. These are not subtle climate variations. These are planetary convulsions. Events violent enough to flip ecosystems, to trigger mass extinctions, to force populations into desperate migration or extinction. The most recent dramatic event is called the Younger Dryas. It lasted from approximately 12,800 years ago until 11,600 years ago. 1,200 years of abrupt return to Ice Age conditions in the middle of warming period. The Earth was warming. The last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent Ice Age, occurred around 20,000 years ago. Ice sheets covered Canada, Northern Europe, Scandinavia. Sea levels sat 400 feet lower than today. Coastlines extended miles beyond their current positions. Then, the ice began melting. Gradually, predictably, temperatures rose, ice sheets retreated, sea levels climbed, and then, suddenly, everything reversed. Around 12,800 years ago, temperatures plummeted. Ice sheets that had been retreating began advancing again. Glaciers returned to regions that had been ice-free for thousands of years. The climate flip occurred within a decade, not a slow drift into colder conditions, a sudden collapse. In Greenland, ice core data shows temperature dropping 15 degrees Fahrenheit within 10 years. In some proxies, the change appears even faster, possibly within a single year. One generation experienced the shift from warming interglacial to brutal glacial cold, and it lasted 12 centuries. Then, just as abruptly, it ended. Around 11,600 years ago, temperatures spiked upward again. Within 50 years, the planet returned to warm conditions. The glaciers melted. Sea levels rose. The Younger Dryas boundary, the moment of both its beginning and its end, is marked in the geological record by sudden, dramatic transitions. Something triggered these flips. Not gradual orbital mechanics, not slow Milankovitch cycles. Something acute, immediate, catastrophic enough to destabilize global climate in a decade. For years, scientists debated the cause. Ocean circulation changes, volcanic eruptions, solar variations. Then they found the platinum. Platinum is rare on Earth's surface. It exists in the crust at trace levels, a few parts per billion, but it is abundant in asteroids and comets. Extraterrestrial objects contain platinum at concentrations hundreds of times higher than terrestrial rocks, in sediment layers dating to 12,800 years ago, the exact moment of Younger Dryas onset. Platinum levels spike, not slightly, dramatically, 50 times normal concentration. The platinum layer appears across multiple continents: North America, Europe, Asia, South America. A global signature. Along with the platinum, nanodiamonds. Microscopic diamonds that form only under extreme pressure and heat, the kind produced by cosmic impacts or airbursts. Carbon spherules. Tiny beads of melted carbon formed when organic material is exposed to temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius. These appear in the same sediment layer across the globe. Magnetic grains, showing properties consistent with impact melt. And in North America, a black mat, a layer of sediment rich in carbon and biological remains, the kind that forms after widespread wildfires burn across continents. The evidence points to a single conclusion. 12,800 years ago, something from space struck Earth. Not a single massive asteroid impact like the one that killed the dinosaurs. The evidence suggests fragmented impacts, multiple airbursts, a comet breaking apart in the atmosphere and exploding over North America, Europe, and possibly other regions. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. When it was first proposed in 2007, it met fierce resistance. Impacts are rare. Catastrophism, the idea that rapid, violent events shape Earth's history, had long been dismissed in favor of uniformitarianism, the principle that slow, gradual processes explain geological change. But the evidence accumulated. More sites, more platinum spikes, more nanodiamonds, more melt signatures, and the timing was undeniable. The impact layer sits directly at the Younger Dryas boundary. The climate reversal begins immediately after. The mechanism became clear. Airbursts over ice sheets, fragmented comet exploding in atmosphere with force equivalent to millions of megatons, heat intense enough to melt rock, shock waves powerful enough to destabilize glaciers, ice sheet collapse, meltwater surging into oceans, fresh water disrupting thermohaline circulation, the ocean conveyor belt that regulates global climate. North Atlantic current shuts down. Gulf Stream weakens. Heat distribution collapses. Within a decade, the Northern Hemisphere plunges back into Ice Age cold. And then, 1,200 years later, the system restabilizes. The ice melts again. Climate flips back. But the damage is done. Across North America, megafauna vanish. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, short-faced bears. 35 genera of large mammals go extinct within centuries of the Younger Dryas onset. The Clovis culture, North America's most widespread Paleo-Indian population, disappears from the archaeological record. Their distinctive spear points vanish. Sites are abandoned. Something ended them. Not gradually, suddenly. The kind of sudden catastrophe that cosmic impact produces. The Younger Dryas is not unique. It is simply the most recent dramatic climate reversal in the ice core record. Older events appear throughout the glacial cycles. Dansgaard-Oeschger events, rapid warming episodes during ice ages, temperature spikes of 10 to 15 degrees within decades, lasting centuries or millennia before flipping back to cold. Heinrich events, massive iceberg discharge events, ice sheets calving catastrophically, fresh water flooding into oceans, climate disruption following. These are not anomalies, they are the norm. Over the past 100,000 years, climate has been wildly unstable, flipping between states every few thousand years, sometimes every few centuries. The current epoch, the Holocene, beginning 11,700 years ago, is unusual precisely because it is stable. For nearly 12,000 years, temperatures have remained within a narrow band. No dramatic reversals, no sudden flips, predictable seasons, reliable climate. This stability is exceptional. It is also precisely the stability required for civilization to develop. Agriculture requires predictability. You plant crops expecting they will grow. Cities require surplus. Trade requires confidence that routes will remain viable. None of this functions during climate chaos. During Dansgaard-Oeschger oscillations, growing seasons become unreliable. Coasts flood and retreat unpredictably. Migration routes shift. Complex societies cannot develop under such conditions, or, if they do develop, they cannot persist. Which raises the question, what if complex societies did develop during earlier stable periods? Interglacials, warm periods between ice ages, occur every 100,000 years. Each lasts 10,000 to 15,000 years before climate destabilizes and glaciation returns. The previous interglacial, called the Eemian, occurred 130,000 to 115,000 years ago. Temperatures were similar to today's, possibly warmer. Sea levels were 15 to 20 feet higher. For 15,000 years, climate was stable, long enough for civilization to develop. If it did, the evidence would now be underwater, beneath ice, buried under sediment from subsequent glacial cycles. We would never find it, not because it did not exist, but because time and geology erased it. The ice core record shows the potential for stability and the inevitability of collapse. Volcanic winters add another reset mechanism. 74,000 years ago, Mount Toba erupted in what is now Indonesia. The eruption ejected 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. Ash, sulfur dioxide, aerosols that circled the globe and blocked sunlight. For 6 to 10 years, global temperatures dropped. Volcanic winter. Crops failed worldwide. Ecosystems collapsed. The genetic evidence shows what happened to humanity. Human population crashed, bottlenecked to perhaps 3,000 to 10,000 individuals worldwide. Near extinction, not metaphorical, literal. Humanity came within a few thousand breeding pairs of vanishing entirely. The survivors were scattered, isolated, genetically impoverished. It took tens of thousands of years for populations to recover. This is documented, measurable. The genetic signatures are unambiguous. A volcanic eruption nearly erased our species. And Toba is not the only supervolcano in Earth's geological history. Yellowstone, Campi Flegrei, Lake Taupo. Each has erupted catastrophically in the past. Each will erupt again. The question is not whether such events occur. The question is whether civilizations existed to experience them. If complex societies developed 80,000 years ago during a stable climatic window, Toba would have annihilated them. Not gradually, within a single generation. Cities abandoned, trade networks collapsed, technologies forgotten. Populations reduced to scattered survivors struggling to endure volcanic winter. Within a century, most physical evidence would be gone. Wood structures decay, textiles rot, metal corrodes, only stone persists, and even stone can be buried, ground up by glaciers, submerged by rising seas. The survivors would carry knowledge, some of it, fragments. Their descendants would rebuild, partly where possible, but the continuity would be broken. The institutions that preserved knowledge, scribes, libraries, master craftsmen, astronomical observatories, would be gone. What remained would be oral tradition, stories, myths, simplified explanations of complex technologies passed down until the explanations became religious rituals and the technologies became sacred mysteries. This is what catastrophe does to civilization. Not erases it completely, but fractures it so thoroughly that recovery becomes indistinguishable from invention. Sea level rise provides the final reset mechanism. Between 20,000 years ago and 8,000 years ago, global sea levels rose 400 feet. Not uniformly, not gradually at a steady rate. In pulses. Meltwater pulse 1. A occurred around 14,500 years ago. In the span of 500 years, perhaps less, sea levels jumped 16 to 25 meters, 50 to 80 feet of ocean rise. Coastlines that had been stable for thousands of years vanished. River deltas flooded. Coastal plains submerged. Islands disappeared. If you lived on the coast during Meltwater Pulse 1A, your world ended. Not metaphorically. Your homeland drowned. Your fields flooded. Your settlements abandoned. You fled inland, or you died. Meltwater Pulse 1. B occurred around 11,400 years ago. Another surge, another pulse of rising water. These were not slow encroachments that people could adapt to over generations. These were rapid enough to be experienced within individual lifetimes. A person born on a coastline could watch that coastline retreat kilometers inland by the time they were elderly. That is fast enough to remember, fast enough to traumatize, fast enough to become myth. And the myths exist. Flood stories appear in every ancient culture worldwide. Not just Middle Eastern, not just Mediterranean, everywhere. Sumerian Gilgamesh, Hebrew Noah, Greek Deucalion, Hindu Manu, Chinese Gunyu, Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime, Native American traditions from dozens of tribes. The details vary. The core is consistent. Water rises, lands drown. Few survive. Humanity rebuilds. Standard explanation. Floods are common. Rivers overflow. These myths reflect local flooding events mythologized into universal narratives. But local floods do not create stories of mountains becoming islands, of seas covering the world, of water reaching heights where only peaks remain. Local floods are temporary. Water recedes, lands dry, life returns. The myths describe permanent transformation, water that rose and stayed, coastlines lost forever, lands that never dried because they were now sea floor. That matches sea level rise, not river flooding, and the timing matches. The flood myths cluster around specific time periods, 12,000 to 8,000 years ago, precisely when meltwater pulses occurred, when coastal regions drowned, when millions of square miles of habitable land vanished beneath rising seas. If coastal civilizations existed, and humans preferentially settled coasts for 100,000 years, then rising seas would destroy them, not leave ruins on dry land, drown them. The evidence would be underwater, under sediment, inaccessible to conventional archaeology. We would know they existed only through myths, through stories passed down by survivors who fled inland, through oral traditions that preserved memory of drowned homelands. And we would dismiss those stories as primitive superstition, unless we took them seriously. Unless we recognized flood myths, not as fantasy, but as compressed historical memory, as trauma narratives transmitted across 10,000 years. The pattern is clear. Cosmic impacts, volcanic winters, meltwater pulses, rapid climate reversals. These are not theoretical. These are documented events dated precisely, measurable in ice cores, sediment layers, genetic bottlenecks. Each was severe enough to devastate populations, disrupt food supplies, destroy infrastructure, force migration or extinction. And each occurred during human existence. The question is not whether these catastrophes happened. They did. The question is what level of complexity human societies had achieved before catastrophe struck. If hunter-gatherers experienced younger dryas, they migrated, adapted, survived in small bands. But if agriculturalists experienced it, if coastal cities with trade networks and institutional knowledge experienced it, catastrophe would erase them, not completely. Survivors remain, fragments persist. Knowledge carried orally becomes myth. Technology simplified becomes tradition. But continuity breaks. The archaeological record would show not gradual development but gaps, discontinuities, sudden appearances of sophistication without clear predecessors, which is exactly what we find. Göbekli Tepe appears suddenly, sophisticated immediately, then buried deliberately as if preservation mattered more than use. Egyptian precision peaks early, then degrades. Knowledge appears complete, then fragments. This is the signature of recovery, not invention. This is what happens when catastrophe interrupts civilization and survivors rebuild from memory. The resets are documented. The catastrophes are proven. The only question remaining: did prior civilizations exist to experience them? DNA does not lie. It cannot be rewritten by conquerors, cannot be edited by scribes with agendas, cannot be lost in fires that consume libraries. Genetic code preserves history that artifacts cannot. Population movements, interbreeding events, bottlenecks, extinctions, survivals. Every human alive carries an archive written in 4 chemical letters, an archive that records not just individual ancestry, but species history. And that history contains ghosts, populations that existed, interbred with anatomically modern humans, then vanished, not gradually assimilated, vanished, left behind only genetic signatures and questions without comfortable answers. The bottlenecks appear clearly. Human genetic diversity is strangely low for a species as widespread and numerous as ours. Chimpanzees, confined to equatorial Africa with populations under 300,000, show greater genetic diversity than humans, who number 8 billion and inhabit every continent except Antarctica. That pattern indicates something reduced human populations severely, multiple times, recently enough that diversity has not fully recovered. The most severe bottleneck appears around 70,000 years ago. Human population crashed to approximately 3,000 to 10,000 individuals worldwide. Total. Across all of Africa, Asia, and any other regions humans had reached, fewer than 10,000 people. This is not speculation. This is what the genetic diversity requires. The mathematical models are clear. The mitochondrial DNA, passed exclusively through maternal lines, shows diversity so low it can only be explained by near extinction. The timing matches the Toba supervolcano eruption 74,000 years ago. Volcanic winter, global temperatures plummeting, ecosystems collapsing. Humanity survived, barely. But whatever social complexity existed before Toba, whatever knowledge had accumulated, whatever technologies had developed, that complexity could not have survived intact. 10,000 people scattered across continents, isolated, struggling to endure volcanic winter. No trade networks, no specialization, no institutional knowledge transmission. Survival, only survival. Everything else is luxury, and luxury does not survive near extinction. If civilization had developed before Toba, if humans 80,000 years ago had built cities, developed agriculture, accumulated astronomical knowledge, Toba would have erased it. Not the people entirely, but the civilization absolutely. The survivors would carry fragments, stories, techniques, but the institutions that preserved complete knowledge would be gone. Recovery would begin from scattered remnants. A second bottleneck appears around 12,000 years ago, less severe than Toba, but significant. Genetic diversity drops again. Population contracts. The timing matches the Younger Dryas, 12,800 years ago. Cosmic impact, climate reversal, megafauna extinction. Again, humans survive, but populations crash. And again, whatever complexity existed beforehand faces severe disruption. If coastal civilizations thrived during the warming period before Younger Dryas, taking advantage of 8,000 years of climate stability, the impact and subsequent glacial return would devastate them. Coastal settlements flooded by meltwater pulses. Agricultural systems disrupted by sudden cold. Trade networks broken by population collapse. The genetic signal shows stress, contraction, near catastrophe, and then recovery. But recovery is not restoration. Recovery is rebuilding, often without complete knowledge of what was lost. The ghost populations reveal something more unsettling. In 2010, scientists sequenced DNA from a 40,000-year-old finger bone found in Denisova Cave in Siberia. The bone was small, a fragment, unremarkable. The DNA was extraordinary. It did not match modern humans, did not match Neanderthals. It represented a distinct hominin lineage, a population that had diverged from the modern human Neanderthal ancestor hundreds of thousands of years ago. Denisovans, named after the cave where the first specimen was identified. We have 3 bones, a finger, 2 teeth. That is all. But the DNA tells a complex story. Denisovans interbred with modern humans, multiple times, in multiple locations. Their genetic signature appears in modern populations across Southeast Asia, Oceania, and the Pacific Islands. Melanesians carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA. Aboriginal Australians carry traces. Papuans, Filipinos, indigenous populations from Indonesia to Polynesia, all carry Denisovan genetic material. This means sustained contact, geographic overlap, cultural interaction. Denisovans were not a failed evolutionary branch that went extinct in isolation. They were widespread, successful, technologically capable. The evidence from Denisova Cave shows sophisticated behavior, jewelry, worked bone tools, pigments, symbolic thought, and then they vanished. Not gradually absorbed through interbreeding, vanished as a distinct population. No Denisovan settlements remain, no cities, no monuments, nothing except 3 bone fragments and the genetic echo in modern humans. If we did not have DNA evidence, we would not know Denisovans existed. Their entire existence would be invisible to archaeology. This is the critical point. A widespread, successful, technologically sophisticated human population lived, thrived, built cultures, and then disappeared, leaving almost no physical evidence. Only genetics proved they existed. How many other populations might have existed and vanished completely? Populations that left no bones in the right caves, no DNA that happened to preserve, no lucky accidents of fossilization. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is only evidence of absence of evidence. Modern humans show similar mysteries. Genetic studies reveal population movements that do not align with archaeological expectations. Aboriginal Australians arrived in Australia approximately 65,000 years ago. That date is important. 65,000 years ago, sea levels were lower but not low enough to create land bridges from Southeast Asia to Australia. The journey required crossing open ocean, multiple water gaps, some stretches exceeding 60 miles of open sea. This requires watercraft, sophisticated watercraft. Not logs tied together, not rafts that barely float. Seaworthy vessels capable of transporting enough people to establish viable populations, capable of carrying supplies, tools, animals, capable of navigating without sight of land. That level of maritime technology is not supposed to exist 65,000 years ago. According to conventional timelines, humans were not cognitively modern enough, not organized enough, not technologically advanced enough. But they reached Australia, which means the technology existed. And if it existed for crossing to Australia, it existed for other purposes. Coastal navigation, fishing, trade, exploration. A maritime culture sophisticated enough for open ocean voyaging would develop institutions, navigation knowledge, boat-building traditions, coastal settlements, all of which would be underwater now. Sea levels have risen 400 feet since 65,000 years ago. The coastlines where maritime peoples would have lived are now continental shelves, drowned landscapes, submerged sites. We would never find them through conventional land-based archaeology. Polynesian navigation presents a similar problem. Polynesians colonized the Pacific Islands using sophisticated navigation techniques. No instruments, no compasses, no written charts. They navigated by stars, by wave patterns, by cloud formations, by bird behavior, by bioluminescence. This knowledge was transmitted orally, generation to generation, for thousands of years. When Europeans first encountered Polynesian navigators, they dismissed the claims as impossible. Surely, these island peoples had simply drifted randomly until they found land. Then, modern researchers trained with traditional navigators learned the techniques, reconstructed voyages using only traditional methods. It worked. Polynesian navigation is not primitive. It is sophisticated. It requires understanding ocean currents, celestial mechanics, meteorology, and biology. It requires institutional knowledge, training systems, cultural transmission across generations. This is not simple technology. This is complex, specialized expertise. And it was maintained orally, without writing, across thousands of miles and hundreds of generations. If oral transmission can preserve advanced navigation knowledge for millennia, what else might be preserved orally? What other knowledge might exist in cultures without writing? Knowledge that appears primitive only because we associate sophistication with literacy. The genetic evidence confirms Polynesian achievement. Sweet potato DNA shows South American origins, yet sweet potatoes were cultivated in Polynesia before European contact. The only explanation, pre-Columbian contact between Polynesians and South America, trans-Pacific voyaging, thousands of miles of open ocean, centuries before Columbus. Chicken DNA tells the same story. South American chickens show Polynesian genetic markers dating to before 1492. This was not drift. This was deliberate navigation, repeated voyages, cultural contact, maintained without writing, without metal tools, without any of the technologies we associate with advanced civilization. Sophistication and complexity do not require the markers archaeologists search for. They can exist in forms that leave minimal physical traces. Maritime cultures, oral knowledge systems, coastal settlements now underwater, invisible to traditional archaeology, visible only in genetics and mythology. The coastal hypothesis emerges from these patterns. For 100,000 years, probably longer, humans preferentially settled coastlines. This is not speculation. This is behavioral logic. Coasts offer abundant food, fish, shellfish, seabirds, marine mammals, predictable resources that do not require seasonal migration. Coasts enable travel. Following shorelines requires no navigation skill. Boats extend range. Trade becomes viable. Coasts provide mild climates, moderated by ocean temperatures, less extreme than inland regions. Every advantageous factor for settlement concentrates on coasts, which means the most successful human populations, the largest, most stable, most sophisticated, would have developed on coasts. Not inland, not in deserts, not on mountain tops, coastlines. Where are those coastlines now? Underwater. The last glacial maximum occurred 20,000 years ago. Sea levels were 400 feet lower. Coastlines extended miles, sometimes hundreds of miles, beyond current shores. The Persian Gulf was a river valley, fertile, watered by the Tigris and Euphrates, joining into a single waterway, draining into the Indian Ocean. Sundaland connected Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines into a single landmass. Forests, rivers, rich ecosystems. Beringia linked Asia and North America. Not barren tundra, but steppe grasslands supporting megafauna herds. Doggerland joined Britain to continental Europe. Temperate plains inhabited by humans for thousands of years. These were not marginal environments. These were prime territory. And all of it is underwater now. Not slightly submerged. Not accessible to scuba divers. Under 30 to 60 meters of water, covered by sediment, erased by 12,000 years of tidal action, storms, and geological processes. If advanced coastal civilizations existed during the stable climatic periods before sea level rise, their remains are inaccessible, not hidden by conspiracy, drowned by geology. We study the refugees, the survivors who fled inland when the coasts drowned. We excavate their highland settlements, their desert cities, their mountain temples. And we call this the beginning of civilization. But it might be the restart, the recovery point, the place where survivors regrouped after losing their homeland to the rising seas. The genetic evidence supports this interpretation. Migration patterns in ancient DNA show movements from coastal regions inland, population expansions radiating from now submerged areas. As sea levels rose, populations moved, carrying their genetics inland, mixing with inland populations, creating the genetic landscape we see today. But the origin populations, the coastal peoples themselves, left no settlements we can excavate. Only their DNA remains, in the populations they joined, in the descendants who survived. Ghost populations, known only genetically, invisible archaeologically, just like the Denisovans, except we do not even have their bones, only the memory encoded in our genes, and perhaps in our myths, flood stories, drowned homelands, lost paradises beneath the waves, not fantasy. Memory, compressed, mythologized, transmitted orally until writing emerged and the stories could be fixed in text, but fundamentally preserving truth. That the world changed, that water rose, that lands drowned, that people fled, that something was lost, and that we are the descendants of those who survived the loss. The genetics paint a picture of human history more complex than the archaeological record alone suggests. Multiple populations, widespread sophistication, advanced maritime capabilities, sudden bottlenecks from catastrophic events, and vast regions of prime settlement territory, now inaccessible beneath the sea. We see the survivors, the inland peoples, the highland refugees. We do not see what they fled from. We do not see the coastal civilizations that might have existed during the stable periods between catastrophes. But the genetics preserve their signature in bottlenecks, in ghost populations, in migration patterns, in the DNA of modern humans carrying traces of peoples who vanished. The story is incomplete, but the fragments suggest a pattern, cycles of development, punctuated by catastrophe, followed by population collapse, followed by recovery. Not linear progress, cyclical, interrupted, reset repeatedly, and each time survivors rebuild, carrying what they can, remembering what they must, until the next reset. Imagine standing on the shore during the last glacial maximum, 20,000 years ago. The Ice Age at its peak. You stand where the ocean should be. But there is no ocean, only land, dry land extending miles beyond the current coastline. Rivers flow through valleys that are now submarine canyons. Forests grow where now only fish swim. Plains stretch toward a horizon that modern geography does not recognize. This is not imagination. This is documented fact. During glacial periods, ice accumulates on land. Water that would normally circulate through ocean and atmosphere gets locked in ice sheets, glaciers kilometers thick, covering Canada, Scandinavia, Northern Europe. That water has to come from somewhere. It comes from the ocean. Sea levels drop dramatically. At the last glacial maximum, global sea levels sat 120 to 130 meters lower than today, roughly 400 feet. That is not a minor change. That is a complete transformation of global geography. 8 to 10 million square miles of land that is currently underwater was exposed, habitable, prime territory, and then, over the next 12,000 years, it all drowned. The Persian Gulf was not a gulf. During the Ice Age, the Gulf was a river valley. The Tigris and Euphrates, along with the Karun River from Iran, joined into a single waterway, the Urshat River. It flowed through a fertile valley approximately 500 miles long. Watered plains, rich soil, the kind of landscape that attracts settlement. This is the region that would later become Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. But the cradle was larger once. During the Ice Age, the cradle extended into what is now underwater. The northern Persian Gulf sat exposed, habitable, ideal for agriculture, fishing, trade. Geoffrey Rose, an archaeologist specializing in Arabia, proposed the Gulf Oasis hypothesis. The idea is simple. During the Ice Age, the Persian Gulf Basin was not just habitable, but optimal, a refuge during glacial periods, protected by surrounding highlands, watered by multiple rivers, connected to both Africa and Asia. An ideal location for human populations to develop complexity, agriculture, permanent settlements, trade networks, social stratification, all the markers of civilization. And then the ice melted, slowly at first, then in pulses. Meltwater Pulse 1A, around 14,500 years ago. Meltwater Pulse 1B, around 11,400 years ago. The Gulf Basin flooded, not gradually enough to adapt, fast enough to experience as catastrophe. Settlements drowned, agricultural lands submerged. The entire valley transformed into saltwater gulf. The survivors fled, inland, up the river valleys, to higher ground. They carried what they could, knowledge, techniques, stories, and they rebuilt. In Mesopotamia, on the shores of the new coastline, where Eridu would emerge as the first city in Sumerian records. Except it was not the first city. It was the first city we can excavate. The actual first cities are underwater, under 30 to 60 meters of water and sediment. Inaccessible to conventional archaeology, the Gulf is not unique. Sundaland was enormous. During the Ice Age, Indonesia, Malaysia, and much of the Philippines were connected, a landmass the size of Europe, tropical forests, river systems, coastlines that extended hundreds of miles beyond current shores. Humans lived there. This is not speculation. Archaeological sites in Southeast Asia show human occupation for tens of thousands of years. But the best sites, the coastal settlements where populations would have been largest and most sophisticated, are now under the South China Sea. When sea levels rose, Sundaland fragmented. Islands appeared where continuous land had existed. The Java Sea formed. The Gulf of Thailand flooded. Millions of square miles of territory vanished. And with it, any evidence of societies that had developed there. No one is excavating the Java Sea floor systematically. No one is mapping submerged settlement patterns. The costs are prohibitive, the technology challenging, the funding non-existent. We know humans lived on Sundaland. We know Sundaland had prime territory. We know it drowned. Everything else is invisible. Beringia connected Asia and North America. Not a narrow land bridge, a subcontinent, 1,000 miles wide at its maximum extent, steppe grasslands supporting megafauna, mammoths, bison, horses. Humans crossed Beringia to reach the Americas. But they did not just cross it. They lived on it for thousands of years. Beringia was not a highway. It was a homeland. And then the seas rose. The Bering Strait opened. Water flooded through. Beringia fragmented. The eastern sections became Alaska. The western sections remained Siberia. The center drowned. Any settlements that existed on central Beringia are now under the Bering Sea, under the Chukchi Sea, under the Beaufort Sea. No one is excavating them. We know humans were there because we find their descendants on both sides of the current strait. Genetics confirms crossing. Archaeological sites in Alaska and Siberia show occupation. But the heartland is gone, underwater, inaccessible. Doggerland joined Britain to Europe. During the Ice Age, Britain was not an island. It was a peninsula, connected to continental Europe through what is now the North Sea. Doggerland, a temperate plain, rivers, lakes, forests, rich hunting grounds. Humans lived there. Mesolithic peoples occupied Doggerland for thousands of years. Seasonal camps, fishing sites, tool-making locations. We know this because fishing trawlers occasionally dredge up artifacts, stone tools, bones, fragments of worked wood, fragments accidentally caught in nets, not systematically excavated, not studied in context, but enough to prove Doggerland was inhabited. Around 8,000 years ago, the remnants of Doggerland finally submerged completely. Rising seas claimed the last high ground. Britain became an island. Any permanent settlements, if they existed, are now under the North Sea, under sediment, inaccessible. We study the refugees who fled to higher ground, who moved to Britain, who moved to continental Europe. We do not study the homeland they fled from, because it no longer exists above water. The pattern is global. Every inhabited coastline during the Ice Age is now underwater, not just in a few regions, everywhere. The Mediterranean coastline extended miles beyond its current position. Islands that are now separate were connected. Coastal plains that no longer exist supported settlements. The Atlantic coastline of North America, the Pacific coastline of South America, the African coastlines, the Asian coastlines, the Australian coastlines. All have moved inland by miles or tens of miles as sea levels rose. The old coastlines, where humans preferentially settled for 100,000 years, are gone. Not destroyed, drowned, preserved under sediment and seawater, but completely inaccessible to traditional archaeological methods. Marine archaeology has found fragments, occasionally, expensively, in shallow waters where technology allows. Pavlopetri, off the coast of southern Greece, sits 5 meters underwater, a Bronze Age city, 5,000 years old. Streets, buildings, tombs intact, submerged by earthquakes and gradual subsidence, preserved by water, visible because it is shallow enough for divers to explore. This is a 5,000-year-old city in the Mediterranean, well within the historical period, recent enough that writing, pottery, and metal artifacts survive. And it was only discovered in 1967. If a city this recent can remain unknown until the late 20th century, what else remains undiscovered? Dwarka, in the Gulf of Kambat off the coast of India, shows underwater structures dated to possibly 9,000 years ago. Controversial, disputed. The dating is debated. The nature of the structures, natural geological formations versus human-made architecture, is argued, but something is there. Something geometric, something with right angles and regular patterns. Whether natural or artificial, it demonstrates that exploration of submerged landscapes reveals unexpected findings. The Yonaguni Monument off the coast of Japan presents similar controversy. An underwater rock formation with flat surfaces, straight edges, and what appear to be carved steps. Natural geological formation, or human-modified structure. The debate continues, because underwater archaeology is difficult, expensive, limited by depth, visibility, currents, and funding. Most of the ocean floor remains unexplored. Less than 5% has been mapped in detail. We know more about the surface of Mars than we know about the floor of our own oceans. And the floor of our own oceans contains 12,000 years of drowned coastlines. The flood myths begin to make sense. Every ancient culture has flood stories, not similar stories, the same story, told with local variations but containing consistent core elements. Water rises dramatically, unstoppably. Lands drown. Mountains become islands. Few survive. Humanity rebuilds. The stories appear in cultures with no historical contact, separated by oceans, developed independently. Sumerians told of Ziusudra surviving flood in a boat. Babylonians told of Utnapishtim. Hebrews told of Noah. Greeks told of Deucalion. Hindu texts describe Manu. Chinese mythology includes Gunyu controlling great floods. Native American traditions from dozens of tribes, Ojibwe, Hopi, Cherokee, Aztec, contain flood narratives. Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime stories describe the flooding of coastal plains. Specific geographic features now underwater are named and described. Polynesian myths across the Pacific tell of rising seas and drowned lands. The standard academic response: floods are common, rivers overflow, tsunamis strike coasts, Every culture experiences flooding, so every culture develops flood myths. That explanation fails on details. River floods are temporary. Water recedes. The land dries. Life returns. These are seasonal or occasional disruptions, manageable, not world-ending. The myths do not describe temporary flooding. They describe permanent transformation. Water that rose and stayed. Lands that never dried. Coastlines lost forever. They describe exactly what meltwater pulses and sea level rise produced. The Black Sea flood provides specific example. Around 7,500 years ago, the Mediterranean Sea breached the Bosphorus Strait. Salt water poured into what was then a freshwater lake, the Black Sea. The flooding was catastrophic. The lake level rose rapidly. Coastal settlements around the Black Sea drowned. Freshwater ecosystems collapsed. Saltwater replaced freshwater. This is geologically documented. Sediment cores show the transition. The timing is precise. The evidence is unambiguous. And the region surrounding the Black Sea is where multiple flood myths originate. The Hebrew Noah story, the Sumerian Ziusudra story, the Greek Deucalion story, all from cultures in proximity to the Black Sea, not metaphorical, geographic. These myths describe a real event, an event their ancestors experienced, an event traumatic enough that memory survived 7,500 years of oral transmission until writing could fix it permanently. If the Black Sea flood generated myths that survived millennia, what myths did the drowning of the Persian Gulf generate? The submersion of Sundaland, the flooding of Beringia, the same myths, different names, different local details, same core event. The world changed, water rose, lands drowned, survivors fled, humanity rebuilt. This is not primitive superstition. This is history, compressed into narrative, mythologized through retelling, but fundamentally preserving truth. The drowned world holds the missing evidence. If sophisticated coastal civilizations developed during stable climatic periods, if they accumulated knowledge, built cities, established trade, the proof is underwater. Not on mountain tops, not in deserts, not preserved in caves, drowned, under sediment, under 30 to 60 meters of seawater. Some of it might be accessible in shallow waters, in regions where tectonic activity hasn't buried everything under additional sediment. But a systematic exploration would require investments archaeology does not make. Deep sea submersibles, remote-operated vehicles, sonar mapping, sediment coring, underwater excavation techniques. Technologies that exist, but are expensive, and directed primarily toward resource extraction, oil, minerals, fishing grounds, not archaeological investigation. We could explore the drowned coastlines. We choose not to. Not because of conspiracy, because of cost, because of institutional priorities, because archaeology focuses on land-based sites that are cheaper and easier to excavate. The bias is structural, not ideological. But the result is the same. the most important evidence for pre-existing civilizations remains unexplored, unexcavated, unknown. Not because it does not exist, but because we are not looking. The drowned world changes everything. If we accept that prime settlement territory is underwater, if we acknowledge that coastal populations would have been largest and most sophisticated, then the archaeological record becomes explicitly incomplete. We are not studying civilization's origins. We are studying its recovery, the inland sites, the highland refuges, the places survivors fled to when the coasts drowned. Göbekli Tepe is not humanity's first temple. It is the first temple built by refugees from drowned coastlines. Eridu is not the first city. It is the first city built by survivors of the flooded Gulf oasis. The Neolithic Revolution is not invention. It is reconstruction, re-establishing agriculture, reorganizing society, rebuilding institutions, using knowledge inherited from before the catastrophe, from the drowned world, from the civilizations that existed when sea levels were 400 feet lower and coastlines extended miles beyond their current positions. This is not fringe theory. This is logical consequence of accepting documented sea level rise. If humans preferentially settled coasts, which they did, and if coasts drowned, which they did, then coastal settlements drowned. The only question is how sophisticated those settlements were. And the answer is hidden beneath the waves, waiting for someone to look. Why, we don't know. The question is not why the evidence is missing. The question is why the narrative is resisted. Sea level rise is documented. Ice core data is published. Genetic bottlenecks are confirmed. Coastal drowning is geological fact. None of this is controversial. What is controversial is the implication that sophisticated societies might have existed before the official beginning of civilization, that the structures we call ancient might be reconstructions rather than inventions, that human history might be cyclical rather than linear. These ideas face institutional resistance, not because they are impossible, but because accepting them requires rewriting frameworks that have been established for over a century. The resistance is not conspiratorial, it is structural. Paradigms protect themselves, not through active suppression, through passive inertia. Thomas Kuhn described how scientific paradigms change. Normal science operates within accepted frameworks. Established theories guide research. Anomalies, observations that do not fit, are acknowledged but minimized, assumed to be measurement errors, misinterpretations, outliers that will eventually be explained within the existing model. And this is not dishonesty. This is how knowledge systems function. Paradigms provide stability. They allow scientists to build on shared assumptions rather than questioning everything constantly. Progress happens within paradigms, incrementally, predictably, until anomalies accumulate. Eventually, the inconsistencies become too numerous to ignore. The paradigm begins to strain. Alternative explanations emerge. Resistance intensifies, not because scientists are close-minded, but because abandoning a paradigm means discarding decades of work built upon it. Careers are invested in existing models. Textbooks are written. Students are trained. Institutions are structured around paradigmatic assumptions. Changing the paradigm is not a simple matter of accepting new evidence. It is a matter of restructuring entire fields, and fields resist restructuring. Archaeology operates within a specific paradigm. Civilization begins approximately 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. Before that, Neolithic villages. Before that, hunter-gatherers. This timeline is not arbitrary. It is based on evidence. Written records appear around 3,200 BCE. Cities appear shortly before. Agriculture develops gradually from around 10,000 BCE onward. The paradigm assumes linear progress, simple to complex, primitive to sophisticated, gradual accumulation of knowledge leading to civilization. This framework has been productive. It guided a century of archaeological discovery. It organized findings into coherent narrative. It allowed predictions about where to excavate and what to expect. But the framework also creates blind spots. If you assume civilization begins 5,000 years ago, you do not search for civilizations older than that. If you assume hunter-gatherers lacked social complexity, you interpret complex structures as anomalies rather than as evidence of complexity. The paradigm shapes what questions are asked and what questions are not asked. When Göbekli Tepe was first excavated in the 1990s, the findings were shocking. The dates were undeniable. The sophistication was obvious. But rather than questioning whether hunter-gatherers could be more complex than assumed, the response was to redefine what hunter-gatherer meant. Cognitive revolution, behavioral modernity, symbolic thought. These explanations preserve the paradigm. They allow the anomaly to be absorbed without requiring fundamental revision. The paradigm bends, but it does not break. The dating problem reinforces paradigmatic thinking. Radiocarbon dating works well for organic materials up to about 50,000 years. Beyond that, the method becomes unreliable. For older sites, or for stone structures that contain no organic material, dating becomes indirect. Geologists date the surrounding sediment. Archaeologists date artifacts found near the structure. Context provides chronology. But this creates circularity. If you assume stone structures are Neolithic or later, you interpret the context accordingly. Artifacts found near the structure are assumed contemporary. Sediment is interpreted as accumulating after construction. If anomalous dates appear, dates that are older than expected, the dates are questioned before the assumptions. The Sphinx water erosion evidence provides clear example. Geologist Robert Schoch examined the Sphinx enclosure and concluded the erosion patterns indicate sustained rainfall. Rainfall that has not occurred in Egypt for 7,000 to 12,000 years. If the erosion is from rainfall, the structure must be older than dynastic Egypt, significantly older. The geological evidence is solid. Multiple geologists have confirmed Schoch's identification of the weathering patterns. But Egyptology has not revised the date, not because the geology is wrong, but because accepting the geology requires abandoning the timeline of Egyptian civilization. If the Sphinx is 10,000 years old, who built it? Pre-dynastic Egypt had no centralized state, no institutional capacity for monumental construction. Accepting an older Sphinx creates more problems than it solves, so the geological evidence is set aside. The date remains 4,500 years. The paradigm is preserved. This is not conspiracy. This is paradigm protection. The system resists information that destabilizes it. Academic territoriality adds another layer of resistance. Archaeology, geology, genetics, and climatology exist as separate disciplines. Each has its own journals, its own conferences, its own standards of evidence. Cross-disciplinary work is difficult. Publishing requires navigating multiple fields. Peer reviewers from one discipline may not understand methods from another. The result? Findings remain siloed. Geologists document climate catastrophes but do not engage with archaeological implications. Geneticists identify population bottlenecks but do not interpret them as evidence of civilization collapse. Archaeologists excavate sites but do not incorporate genetic or climatic data into interpretation. Each field has pieces of the puzzle. None synthesizes them into a coherent whole. When someone attempts synthesis, proposing that geological catastrophes disrupted prior civilizations, they face skepticism from all sides. Archaeologists say, "Where is the archaeological evidence?" Geologists say, "We study Earth systems, not human history." Geneticists say, "Bottlenecks prove population stress, not civilization." Each discipline defends its boundaries. Integration threatens those boundaries. And so the evidence remains fragmented, not hidden, not suppressed, simply unintegrated. Catastrophism carries historical baggage. In the 19th century, geology debated two frameworks. Catastrophism. Earth's features result from sudden, violent events, floods, impacts, eruptions. Uniformitarianism. Earth's features result from slow, gradual processes. Erosion, sedimentation, uplift. Uniformitarianism 1. Not because catastrophes do not occur, but because catastrophism had become associated with biblical literalism, with attempts to prove Noah's flood through geology. The association tainted catastrophism. It became unscientific, rejected by mainstream geology. Uniformitarianism became orthodoxy. Slow, gradual processes. No catastrophes. Change occurs steadily over millions of years. This was productive for understanding many geological processes: plate tectonics, mountain building, sedimentation. But it was wrong about catastrophes. Catastrophes do occur. Impacts happen. Volcanic supereruptions occur. Rapid climate reversals are documented in ice cores. Modern geology has quietly reintegrated catastrophism under new names: neo-catastrophism, punctuated equilibrium, event stratigraphy. The evidence forced revision. but the psychological association remains. Catastrophe still carries connotations of fringe thinking, of pseudoscience, of biblical literalism, proposing that catastrophes disrupted civilizations triggers those associations, even when the geological evidence supports it. The terminology itself creates resistance. The psychological dimension matters most. Humans need stable narratives. History provides identity. Knowing where we came from shapes how we understand who we are. Linear progress, from primitive to sophisticated, is psychologically comforting. It suggests we are at the pinnacle, that our ancestors were less capable, that we have overcome their limitations through accumulated knowledge. Cyclical history threatens this narrative. If civilizations have risen and fallen multiple times, if our ancestors might have been as sophisticated as we are, if progress is not guaranteed, then our position feels precarious. We are not at the end point of inevitable advancement. We are in a cycle, subject to the same forces that reset prior civilizations. That is existentially uncomfortable. Easier to believe in linear progress, in the unique ascent of modern civilization, in the permanence of our achievements. Easier to dismiss anomalies, to preserve the paradigm, to maintain the narrative that makes us feel secure. The resistance to cyclical history is not just institutional. It is psychological, cultural, deeply rooted in how we want to understand ourselves. And that resistance is the most powerful barrier of all. Not conspiracy, not suppression, not even professional territoriality. Just the human need to believe our time is different. That catastrophe is behind us. That progress is permanent. That we will not experience what prior epochs experienced, even when the evidence suggests otherwise. None of this is malicious. The archaeologists dismissing older dates are not lying. They are protecting frameworks that have been productive. The geologists avoiding archaeological implications are not negligent. They are staying within their expertise. The institutions resisting paradigm change are not corrupt. They are functioning as institutions function, maintaining stability, rewarding consensus, discouraging disruption. This is how knowledge systems work. They are conservative by design. They require extraordinary evidence for extraordinary claims. They favor continuity over revolution. These are features, not bugs. Without conservatism, every fringe theory would be taken seriously. Without skepticism, pseudoscience would flourish. Without paradigmatic stability, knowledge would not accumulate reliably. The system is designed to resist change, which means change, when it comes, must be undeniable. The evidence must be overwhelming, reproducible, impossible to dismiss. And for the question of prior civilizations, that evidence is difficult to obtain, because it is underwater, under sediment, inaccessible to conventional excavation. The paradigm protects itself simply by pointing to the absence of easily available proof, not because proof does not exist, but because obtaining it would require investments that are not being made. And so we remain in paradigm, Civilization begins 5,000 years ago. Before that, primitive peoples, linear progress, steady advancement. The anomalies are acknowledged but minimized. Göbekli Tepe is a cognitive revolution, not evidence of prior sophistication. Sphinx erosion is misidentified, not indication of older construction. Flood myths are local events, not compressed memory of global catastrophe. Each anomaly is explained within the paradigm. The paradigm holds, for now. But paradigms do not hold forever. Eventually, the weight of accumulated anomalies becomes too great. The explanations become too strained, the coincidences too numerous. And the paradigm shifts, not because evidence suddenly appears, but because the evidence that was always present is finally interpreted differently. The ice cores were always there. The genetic bottlenecks were always there. The drowned coastlines were always there. What changes is willingness to integrate them into a new narrative. A narrative where civilization is older than we thought, where catastrophes interrupted development, where we are not the first attempt at complexity, where we are the seventh. And the paradigm protecting us from that realization is not conspiracy, it is comfort. The comfort of believing our time is unique. The comfort that catastrophe is myth, not memory. The comfort that we are permanent, not cyclical. But comfort is not truth. And the evidence remains, waiting, patient, for the paradigm to finally shift. The 7th Epoch. We live in unusual times, not because of technology, not because of globalization, not because of any human achievement, but because of climate. The Holocene Epoch, our current geological period, began 11,700 years ago at the end of the Younger Dryas. For nearly 12,000 years, Earth's climate has remained remarkably stable. Temperature variations exist, droughts occur, floods happen, but within a narrow band, predictable, manageable. This stability is what enabled agriculture. You plant seeds expecting consistent seasons. Cities grow expecting reliable food surplus. Trade routes establish expecting predictable conditions. Civilization requires predictability. The Holocene provided it. But the Holocene is geologically abnormal. Over the past 100,000 years, through the last glacial period and earlier interglacials, climate has been violently unstable. Temperature swings of 10 to 15 degrees within decades, rapid flips between glacial and warm conditions, chaotic oscillations that make long-term planning impossible. The previous interglacial, the Eemian, 130,000 to 115,000 years ago, lasted approximately 15,000 years before climate destabilized and ice returned. The Holocene has lasted 11,700 years. We are within the typical window for interglacial periods. Geologically speaking, we are due for instability, not in thousands of years, not in some distant future. Now. And the signals are appearing. The magnetic field is weakening. Earth's magnetic field, generated by molten iron churning in the outer core, protects the planet from solar radiation and cosmic rays. It shields the atmosphere, deflects charged particles, maintains the conditions that allow complex life. The field is not static. It fluctuates. The magnetic poles wander. Occasionally, the field reverses completely. North becomes south. South becomes north. Reversals happen on geological timescales. Hundreds of thousands of years between events. But before reversals, the field weakens. Currently, Earth's magnetic field has lost approximately 10% of its strength over the past 170 years. The rate of decline is accelerating. The South Atlantic anomaly, a region where the field is particularly weak, is expanding. Satellites passing through this region experience increased radiation exposure. Electronics malfunction. The magnetic poles are migrating faster than at any point in recorded history. The North Magnetic Pole currently moves over 30 miles per year. Accelerating. This does not mean a reversal is imminent. The field has weakened before without reversing, but it creates vulnerability. Weakened magnetic field allows more cosmic radiation to reach the surface. This affects climate, ionizes the upper atmosphere, influences cloud formation, alters weather patterns, not catastrophically, but measurably. Small changes in global systems cascade into larger effects. Ice sheets are destabilizing. The Greenland ice sheet is losing mass, not slowly, rapidly, accelerating. Approximately 280 billion tons of ice per year. The West Antarctic ice sheet is losing mass even faster. The Thwaites Glacier, a critical ice formation holding back vast portions of the West Antarctic, is melting from below. Warm ocean water is circulating beneath the glacier, undermining it. If Thwaites collapses, it could trigger cascading collapse across West Antarctica. The result? 10 feet of sea level rise. Not over millennia. Over decades to centuries. Coastal cities worldwide would be inundated. Hundreds of millions displaced. Infrastructure drowned. Agricultural lands flooded. This is not speculative. This is modeling based on current melt rates. The question is not whether ice sheets will lose mass. They are losing mass. The question is how fast. And the models keep revising upward, faster than expected, more unstable than anticipated. The ice is not cooperating with gradual predictions. Climate is not just warming, it is destabilizing. The narrative around climate change focuses on temperature. Global average temperature rising, ice melting, sea levels climbing. But temperature is not the only variable. Climate volatility is increasing. Extreme weather events, droughts, floods, heat waves, cold snaps, are becoming more frequent and more severe. Not because the planet is simply getting warmer, but because energy differentials are increasing. Warmer poles mean reduced temperature gradients between equator and poles. This weakens jet streams, causes atmospheric blocking patterns, creates persistent weather systems that do not move. Droughts last longer. Rainfall becomes more intense. Hurricanes stall over regions instead of passing through. The climate is not simply shifting to a new stable state. It is becoming unstable. This is what precedes major climate transitions. Before the Younger Dryas, climate was warming steadily. Then it flipped. suddenly into glacial conditions. Before Dansgaard-Oeschger events during the Ice Age, climate showed increasing variability. Then it flipped, warming 10 degrees in a decade, then flipping back centuries later. Instability precedes transition. We are seeing instability, not proof of imminent catastrophe, but signature of a system under stress. Technological acceleration mirrors prior epoch patterns. If the 7th Epoch hypothesis is correct, if civilizations have risen and fallen through cycles, then patterns should appear. One pattern: technological acceleration before collapse. Complexity increases. Knowledge accumulates. Societies become more interconnected. Specialization deepens. This is beneficial until it becomes fragile. Hyperconnectivity means failures cascade. A disruption in one region propagates globally. Supply chains break. Financial systems freeze. Communication networks fail. Complexity creates vulnerability. Current civilization is more complex than any prior, more interconnected, more specialized, more dependent on systems functioning perfectly. A solar storm, like the Carrington event of 1859, would cripple modern infrastructure. Power grids, satellites, communication networks, financial systems. In 1859, the impact was minimal. Telegraph systems failed. That was the extent. Today, the same solar storm would devastate technological civilization, not by destroying buildings, by destroying the invisible systems that enable modern life. Recovery would take years, perhaps decades. And that is a known threat. Predictable, measurable. Unknown threats exist. Pandemic pathogens, volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, cascading ecological collapse. The more complex the system, the more potential failure modes. The more interconnected, the faster failures spread. We have built a civilization optimized for stability. But we live in an era of increasing instability. That is not unique to this epoch. That is the pattern preceding every reset. The recognition itself is unprecedented. Prior epochs, if they existed, experienced catastrophe without understanding it. Climate reversed. Ice returned. Seas rose. Populations collapsed. The survivors did not know why. They could not measure magnetic field strength, could not model ice sheet dynamics, could not predict solar storms. They experienced catastrophe as incomprehensible disaster. We experience it as data. For the first time, a civilization can recognize the pattern, can map the cycle, can name the forces that drive resets. We have ice cores showing prior catastrophes, genetic data showing bottlenecks, geological records of impacts and eruptions. We know what happened to prior epochs. The question is whether knowing matters. Does recognition prevent repetition? Or is recognition itself part of the cycle? Perhaps every epoch develops enough sophistication to see the pattern before collapse. Perhaps knowledge accumulates just enough to understand what is coming, but not enough to prevent it. Perhaps the astronomical observatories at Göbekli Tepe, the precision at Giza, the encoded knowledge in megalithic structures. Perhaps these were attempts by prior epochs to preserve knowledge through the coming catastrophe, to encode warnings for the next cycle, to say, this has happened before, and we are only now sophisticated enough to understand the message, not because prior epochs were primitive, but because we are finally complex enough to recognize the pattern they saw. The unsettling implication remains. We are not in unprecedented times. We are in the same position the prior 6 epochs occupied, at the peak of stability, at the height of complexity, with increasing technological capability and increasing systemic fragility, with climate beginning to destabilize, ice sheets melting, magnetic field weakening, extreme events increasing. The markers are present, not proof of imminent collapse, but signature of a system approaching transition. The 7th epoch looks like the prior 6, which means the 7th epoch might end like the prior 6, not through human failure, through planetary cycles we did not create and cannot prevent. Ice ages return, magnetic fields reverse, impacts occur, supervolcanoes erupt. These are not punishments, they are geology. Cycles operating on timescales longer than civilizations persist, longer than human memory extends, except in myth. The question is not whether a reset will occur. On geological timescales, resets are inevitable. The Holocene will end, ice will return, climate will destabilize, something will trigger transition. The question is timing. Decades, centuries, millennia. We do not know. The signals suggest increasing instability, but instability does not guarantee immediate catastrophe. Systems can remain unstable for extended periods before finally transitioning. The magnetic field could continue weakening for centuries before reversing. Ice sheets could collapse gradually rather than catastrophically. Climate volatility could increase without triggering full destabilization, or not. The system is non-linear. Small perturbations can trigger large responses. Tipping points exist. Feedback loops amplify changes. Predicting the exact timing is impossible. What is possible is recognizing the pattern and preparing as much as knowledge allows. What does preparation look like? Not panic, not doomsday bunkers, not abandoning civilization. Resilience, decentralized systems, local food production, preserved knowledge, reduced dependence on fragile global networks. The things that allowed prior epochs to survive. Survivors carried knowledge, maintained skills, preserved traditions, not in digital formats that require electricity, in oral transmission, in physical artifacts, in stone structures encoding astronomical knowledge. They built to outlast catastrophe. That is what Göbekli Tepe might be, what Giza might be, what megalithic observatories worldwide might be. Not temples to gods, archives for survivors, knowledge encoded in stone, preserved through resets, waiting for the next epoch to decipher. And we are that next epoch, reading the archives, decoding the warnings, recognizing the pattern. The message is clear. This has happened before. This will happen again. But knowledge can survive if we make it permanent, if we build to outlast catastrophe, if we preserve what matters for those who come after. That is the inheritance prior epochs left us, and the responsibility we carry for the next. We are the 7th epoch, not the first, not the pinnacle, not the permanent achievement of human progress. The 7th cycle, built on fragments of the 6th, which was built on fragments of the 5th, which remembered pieces of the 4th. Each epoch rising, accumulating knowledge, achieving complexity, each epoch eventually reset. Not erased, interrupted. Reduced to survivors carrying what they could, rebuilding what they remembered, preserving what mattered most. We are those survivors' descendants, and we are building toward the moment when we might become the survivors for the next. The pattern does not demand despair. It demands recognition that we are part of a cycle, that our time is not permanent, that catastrophe is not failure, it is geology, and that the most important thing we can do is preserve knowledge, not in libraries that burn, not in digital systems that fail, not in institutions that collapse, but in structures that outlast epochs, in oral traditions that survive catastrophe, in practical skills passed generation to generation, in stone, in story, in the deep knowledge that humans carry within them. That is what survives resets, not cities, not technology, not complexity, knowledge, encoded, preserved, transmitted from the 6th epoch to the 7th, and from the 7th to the 8th. The silence in archaeological sites is not emptiness, it is memory, encoded in stone, preserved in alignment, whispered in flood myths that span the globe. The structures are not primitive, they are sophisticated, built by people who knew something was coming, who encoded knowledge to survive what they could not prevent. Astronomy in megalithic circles, precision in impossible masonry, observatories aligned to cycles that span millennia. These are not temples to worship gods. These are archives, messages from the 6th epoch to the 7th. From survivors to survivors, they knew, they prepared, they preserved what mattered, and we, finally complex enough to read the message, understand. We are not the first. We are the 7th, and the stone remembers. Always sleep well. The pattern does not demand fear, only recognition that this has happened before, that knowledge survives, that we are part of something larger than progress. We are part of a cycle, and the 7th epoch, like the 6 before, will leave something behind for the 8th.